Good evening, spooky people. Campfire Ghost Stories is back again. We took a brief break last week to recover from some late-night hauntings on Halloween, but we are planning on holding on tight for the winter months. We're looking forward to some holiday haunts to thrill and chill you over the coming winter months, so cuddle up to our weekly fire and get ready for some good scares. Oh, and put the kiddos to bed. These stories are just for grown-ups. Tonight, I'll be reading you a story from The Burr Woman and Other Weird Tales by Raymond Van Over. The inspiration for this story is from a legend of the Nakota tribe, also known as the Assiniboine people. In some editions of this earlier folk tale, the Burr Woman grabs onto a young man and will not let go of him, thus preventing him from living life and fulfilling his role in his tribe. Two young women are tasked with freeing him, and when they do, they both are able to marry him and live free of the terrible burden of the Burr Woman. Tonight's story is about a creature that latches on and never lets go. It manifests literally as a weight on the character's back that he cannot get rid of no matter how hard he tries. And I think I can speak for many people and say that this is a very familiar feeling right now. But I also know that under strain, it feels like getting rid of terrible and oppressive things is an impossible task sometimes. But what is nice about reality versus a horror story is that with work and effort, we can cast off the things that weigh us down and oppress us. It is possible to defeat monsters when we let ourselves recognize and work together to remove them. So to begin, this is Raymond Van Over's story, The Burr Woman, from The Burr Woman and Other Weird Tales. Tobias Smollett was a small man, but he was a dynamo. He had come into the little community in New Mexico only a few years before from the east, and had already built the rundown ranch into a busy cattle and poultry business. The only trouble was that Tobias was as mean as a snake and twice as quick to strike. The 10 or so men who worked the ranch for him took it stoically. They listened, shook their heads, chewed their tobacco, and ignored him. The only reason they all hadn't been fired was that they did their job well, and no one else would work for him. But, though no one could stand Tobias, he met his end in such a nasty fashion that even those who hated him the most were sorry about it. The day it began, Tom Longman, the 14-year-old orphan who'd wandered in off the desert one day, was riding back from town with a full wagon of supplies. Tom knew Tobias took him shopping, so one of the men wouldn't be taken off more important work on the ranch. But he didn't mind. It was fun to get to town every couple of weeks. What he couldn't stand was the constant criticism. The old man just wouldn't leave him alone. Sometimes Tom thought he kept him on just to have an easy target to browbeat. All the other hands kept clear of him, but Tom couldn't. He was around the house all day long doing chores. The day was hot, and the red sand road dusty, just like every other trip to town. And just like every other trip, Tobias had criticized how Tom loaded the wagon. "Now look at that," Tobias said as they bounced along. "The load has shifted." Tom glanced over his shoulder. True, it had moved a bit, but so what? The road's rough. Everything's going to move. "Stop! Didn't you hear me?" Tobias shouted. "The load's shifted. It's going to fall off." Tom looked again. Nothing was going to fall. Just another of Tobias's fits. Oh well, Tom thought. I'll do what the others told me. Cater to him and keep my mouth shut. Tom reined in the horses and pulled on the wagon brake. He jumped down and started to shift the load around. It wasn't necessary, but he had made it look important. Tobias watched, his lips puckered together. Come on, Tobias said. He jumped down from the wagon and walked over to a tree near the road and stood in the shade. He fanned himself with his Sears Roebuck catalog as Tom tried to tighten up an already secure load. Tom did as much as he could and turned to call Tobias when he saw it. A small, black thing quickly flitted between the tall cacti. There it went again. It moved like a blink of an eye. If you weren't looking right at it, you'd miss it. Tom saw it again, this time only about 20 yards in the desert beyond where Tobias was standing. It seemed to be moving closer to Tobias, but Tom couldn't be sure. He wasn't even sure it was anything alive. It might have been a dust devil, or a blowing tumbleweed that looked darker than normal. Then it came clear. It moved across a 10-yard clearing to reach another cactus, and Tom saw what looked like a big monkey. It ran like one of those chimps, upright, but still using its front hands to sort of lope along. But it wasn't a monkey. It couldn't have been. It was wearing clothes, or rags, long, dark rags that floated behind like a small, tattered cape as it ran. Mr. Smollett? Tom called, now alarmed, for he was sure the thing was making for Tobias. Tobias turned toward Tom, just as the thing leapt out from behind a nearby cactus and launched itself through the air. It was amazing to see. Tom later told the other men. The leap must have been at least 10 feet, and it landed squarely on his back. Tobias's face opened in shock. His eyes and mouth almost popped out of his head as he let out a loud "Woof!" and hit the ground face first. Tom ran to him. He was clawing the dirt and groaning in terrible pain. His face was still pressed into the dust. The thing on his back was just about the size of a large monkey or a very small human being. But Tom couldn't see any real shape to it. Where there should have been a head, there was only long, gray, scraggly hair hanging every which way. Something like hairy, pale hands were dug into Tobias's shoulders, but Tom couldn't be sure if they were human or not. What might have been filthy feet were curled around Tobias's waist, the long toes clinging as if they were fingers. The thing had grabbed him so tightly you couldn't see where it began and Tobias left off. It looked just like he'd magically developed a hunchback. Hesitantly, Tom reached out and touched the thing. A tremble ran through it, like a horse's skin shaking off flies. But Tobias went crazy. He screamed and rolled over onto his back, then again and again, rolling in the desert, trying to dislodge the thing. But the more he rolled, the tighter it seemed to grab him, and that made Tobias cry out even more. Tobias jumped up and ran around in a circle, fell down on his back, rolled over, then jumped up again, all the time screaming in pain. Tom tried to catch him, but Tobias was like a madman, crying and yelling. Tears streamed down his face. Then he began backing into the tree, banging the thing as hard as he could. Time and again he'd run forward 5 or 6 feet, then backpedal with his short legs pumping like pistons until he smacked into the tree. But every time he'd do it, Tom could see the pain shoot across his face. Tom admired his courage because he didn't stop until he fell from exhaustion. He didn't move for a long time, and Tom thought he must have fainted, but the thing moved. It shifted a little and seemed to snuffle down even closer, if that was possible. When Tobias woke up, his panic was under control, but Tom could see he was still terrified. "Take me home, Tom," was all he said, and climbed into the wagon. When they reached the ranch, Tobias sent for Doc Friday. While everyone waited for the doctor to arrive, Tobias locked himself in his office. and all the ranch hands gathered around Tom and peppered him with questions about what happened. When Tom finished the story, no one said a word. Then Saul, the cowboy whose face was covered with pockmarks, broke the silence. "The Burr woman," he said quietly. Everyone looked at him. Raoul, the stocky Mexican, said, "Ah, see, we have her in Mexico too." "What the hell is a Burr woman?" someone asked. "She's an old hag the Indians fear. There are legends that say once she gets on someone's back, nothing can get her off. No one knows where she comes from or anything about her, except the Indians think she's very powerful medicine." "Bull," Randy Oakes cut in loudly. "That's superstitious junk." "Yeah? Well, what would you call the thing on Smollett's back?" Saul asked, irritated. "I don't know, but it sure ain't some Indian tall tale," Oakes said, getting up and pulling on his belt. This was a sure sign of a fight coming, and Saul sat back and smiled. He loved to get Oakes mad. Listen, Randy. I'm not saying it's a Burr woman, but I've heard about this before, and it's the only thing I can see that fits. If something's beyond your little brains, why not shut up?" "I think you've shot your mouth off for the last time," Oakes said, starting around the table. Just then Doc Friday came in, and everyone started talking at once. Once more Tom told his story. When he finished, Doc went into Smollett's office without a word. After about 5 minutes, Tobias let out a howl that shook the windows. The office door flew open, and Doc put his head out. "A couple of you men get in here." No one moved. "Now!" Doc yelled. Saul and Tom were closest, and Doc grabbed their arms and shoved them into the office and slammed the door. Tobias was sitting on a stool, his shirt torn off his body. "Come here," Doc ordered. "One of you on each side. Now grab her wrists here," he said to both men, pointing, "and pull when I say so." Saul and Tom searched for a way to get their fingers under the bony, emaciated wrist that seemed glued to Tobias's back. There was just no space where the Burr woman's body pressed against Tobias's. Tom got his fingers partly under the wrist and squeezed as hard as he could. He guessed Saul did the same thing. Doc got behind the Burr woman and grabbed her on both sides. He braced his feet against Tobias's chair and said, "Pull!" Everyone tugged at once, and Tobias wailed in pain. Tom felt the Burr woman's body tremble and jerk itself down closer to Tobias. The harder they pulled, the tighter her hold on Tobias seemed to get. After several minutes of yanking on her, they all stopped exhausted. Tobias slumped over his chair and sobbed. Doc pulled out his pipe with trembling hands. "Well, I guess that's it," he said. "I've never seen anything like this in all my days. Here, look at this." He motioned for Tom and Saul to come closer. Doc gently pressed around her fingers. When you're gentle, she doesn't fight back so violently, but she still lets you pull her away only so far. "See," he said, pointing to where her fingers dug into Tobias's flesh. "It's almost as if her fingers have grown into Tobias's skin." Doc gently moved back her gray hair, and Tom saw a wrinkled, narrow face and one unblinking eye glaring defiantly up at them. "And here," he said, pointing to where you could see her thumb angle back toward the spine. Her thumbs dig right into the skin on each side of the spine. "Look, if I just tug a little." Her response was immediate and strong. The thumb pulled against the pressure and dug deeper into Tobias's back. Tobias jerked and cried out. "It must be incredibly painful. Every time she's pulled away, she digs in deeper." Doc straightened up and looked sadly at him. "I'm sorry, Tobias. There's nothing I can do. I doubt that her grip would loosen even if we killed her." Tobias looked up hopefully at the thought. "Kill her? Sure, why not? and then cut off everything except the fingers. I don't care if they're left in. Just get her off of me." "But look here, Tobias. Even her toenails are dug in. You want to walk around the rest of your life with 2 hands in your neck and back and 2 feet stuck into your flanks?" "Yeah," Tobias pleaded. "Anything. Just get her off." "I can't kill her," Doc said. "I don't know how much of an animal she's become, but from what I see, she's at least part human, and I can't kill someone part human." "Part human? My God, man! Nothing human could do this. It's a beast. Get the damn thing off of me. I'll pay you anything, you name it." "Tobias," Doc said softly. "To be frank, I'm not sure that you would survive our killing her." Tobias's shocked face turned to Doc. "It's almost as if she's become a part of you," Doc continued. "I just don't know how much a part is all. If it's as I suspect, you may die along with her." "Oh my God," Tobias moaned. I can't live like this. I might as well die right now. Kill me and get it over with." His head fell forward and he began to sob. Doc went to his bag and gave Tobias a shot. "This'll keep him quiet. Put him to bed. There's nothing else I can do." Doc walked out of the room, shaking his head and mumbling to himself. "Oddest thing I've ever seen." In the weeks that followed, everyone seemed to accept Tobias's strange condition. It was as if he'd come down with an incurable illness, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. All the men, however, kept their distance from him. Even though no one believed she jumped from Tobias onto anyone else, they weren't taking any chances. Tom still did the house chores, so he saw more of Tobias than anyone. Whenever Tom was near Tobias, he couldn't keep his eyes from the hump. The Burr woman never moved, only adjusted herself occasionally with that peculiar shiver of hers. Tom noticed that when she did tremble or slightly shift, Tobias didn't seem to mind anymore. In fact, he'd adjusted to her presence with surprising speed. It seemed they were becoming a single person. But Tobias was looking worse with every day. He was pale and often complained about terrible fatigue. Tom also noticed the Burr woman was talking to Tobias. He couldn't hear much of it because she whispered mostly when they were alone. The few words he did hear scared him. One day he heard her raspy voice murmuring, "Dear, I'm thirsty." Another time, "Sweetheart, let's go for a walk." At these moments, Tobias seemed shaken. He sometimes shook his head violently and talked back, and an urgent, rapid, whispered conversation would take place. Eventually, Tom noticed Tobias would do what she wanted. It was as if Tobias were struggling to keep possession of his body, or as if his brains were slowly being sucked into the Burr woman. Every time Tobias resisted too vigorously, Tom could see pain flash across his face. About a month after Tobias had been jumped by the Burr woman, Tom took his breakfast in. Tobias was lying on his side as he usually did now, with his eyes wide open. "Come here," he whispered so softly that Tom could barely hear him, "and be quiet." Tom hesitated and then walked over to the bed. "She's asleep," he said quietly. "Early in the mornings like this, I'm free. If I move even a muscle or speak too loudly, she'll wake up." "Listen," he said urgently, his voice full of anxiety. "Help me. I can't live like this. Please, kill me. Kill me, please, I beg you. Get my gun from the table over there and kill me. Do it now." His eyes pleaded with Tom, his face twitching with the effort to remain quiet. "Please, Tom, before she wakes and begins to take over again. I won't last much longer anyway. She's sucking me dry. My life's being sucked away from me every day through these tentacles she's got in me. Shoot me, please. Please kill me, he moaned. Suddenly, Tobias's face twisted in pain, and he groaned aloud. His body stiffened, his arms and legs springing into rigid pulls. He began trembling and moaning, and sweat poured off of him. Then his feet swung over the edge of the bed, and he sat up, back straight, and stared ahead blankly. Tom saw it happen. He slipped from being himself into a movable statue, and the Burr Woman was pulling the strings. Tobias's head swung toward the breakfast tray, and he said softly, as if to himself, "Eat." It was a hollow voice echoing out of Tobias's mouth from a great distance. He got up slowly and sat down in front of the tray and began to eat slowly, mechanically. For several days, nothing else unusual happened. Then one morning, Tom noticed Tobias was suffering more than normal. Every step seemed in agony. His pale face was constantly bathed in sweat. Every time his eyes met Tom's, there was a question, a pleading. Tom knew what he was asking, but he couldn't kill someone. He'd never heard anything in his life, and the thought of killing Tobias made him sick to his stomach. That day, Tobias and Tom went to check the cattle water holes. The trail led along a ledge that fell straight into a 40-foot deep gully. Tobias had gone to sleep in the wagon, and as it slowly made its way along the rutted path, his white, exhausted face had fallen forward on his chest. For some reason, an instinct perhaps, Tom glanced over at Tobias and saw that he was awake. He hadn't moved from his slumped position, but his eyes were wide open and darting about wildly. His head didn't move, but he was obviously desperate. Suddenly, he leapt from the wagon and sprinted toward the edge of the gully. He fell once and cried out in pain. He squeezed his head between his hands and moaned. But he struggled to his feet and stumbled forward. He reached the gully and threw himself, screaming, over the edge. At first, Tom was too shocked to move. Then he jumped down and ran to the lip of the gully. Tobias's body lay smashed, face down on the rocks 40 feet below. Everything was absolutely still. Even the breeze had stopped. Then, she moved. The dark hump on Tobias slowly detached itself from the body. It was as if a hideous suction were being broken, as each hand and foot pulled out of Tobias. Once free, she skipped off the body like a child playing hopscotch and looked up at Tom. For a split second, he had the crazy thought she spoke to him. "Wait, Tom," the high, raspy voice echoed in his mind. "I want you. I'll come for you." A chill ran over him and made his flesh creep. The Burr Woman moved with her peculiar, monkey-like agility toward the gully wall and began to scramble up it. Her voice kept ringing in his ears. "Wait, Tom. I want to be with you." In less than half a minute, she was well up the steep wall. The gray hair had fallen away from her dark, narrow face, and Tom saw her black eyes intent on him. Tom turned and ran, like he'd never run before. He leapt into the wagon and whipped the horses frantically. The wagon jerked ahead and skidded down the dirt road. Panting, Tom looked back over his shoulder and saw the Burr Woman lifting herself over the edge of the gully. She stood there a second and watched the speeding wagon. Then she began to lope after him, running like a chimp chasing a banana. "Oh my God," said Tom aloud. "She's coming after me." And she was. This concludes tonight's story. Before I go, I want to say that if you're feeling like the weight of things is too much to carry, there are a number of services available, especially during the pandemic. Seeking out help or assistance in dealing with your own monsters is how you can free yourself of their power and weight. We have a number of resources listed on our website, and I will link to them in the description. But if you are feeling overwhelmed and need help, the best thing you can do is reach out. No one should have to carry on alone. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back again next week to haunt you with more ghostly tales by the fire. Stay spooky and stay safe. Good night.